Tonight, we're going somewhere strange. Back before bars, before bottles, before anyone even had a word for drunk. Imagine a world without cities, without writing, without rules. A world where taste, smell, and curiosity guided survival. Somewhere in that wild silence, a person bent over a fallen fruit and discovered something different, sweet, warm, a little dizzying. That moment, a sip under the sun of prehistory, was the first time a human being got wasted. The air was thicker then, the forests denser. Seasons ruled life. Rain meant hunger or plenty. Humans followed herds and berries, slept beneath stars and learned the language of the land, not through words, but through taste. Some fruits were sour, some bitter, some sweet enough to make a whole day feel lucky. But once in a while, they found a fruit that tingled, soft, bruised, half-rotten, sitting in sun-warmed grass. It carried a scent that was richer, deeper, almost alive. The first drink was not poured. It was found. Maybe it began with bananas fermenting in a hollow log after a storm. Maybe it was a cluster of figs, split and fizzing with wild yeast. A curious hand tasted the juice, sticky and bubbling. The sweetness burned slightly. A few gulps later, laughter. The world seemed lighter. Colours more vivid. Air more generous. Fear further away. They didn't know what had happened, but something inside whispered, "Keep drinking." Wordless celebrations grew around these accidents. Someone would shout, gesture, share the strange fruit juice, and soon a circle of laughter replaced the quiet of hunger. They didn't know they were holding the first party in history. Firelight danced across faces. A few tripped, a few sang, a few lay back and watched the stars spin. For one night, the world felt less heavy. The dawn, of course, felt different. Dry mouths, sore heads, foggy memories. And yet, when the next harvest came, they looked for these same fermented fruits again. The first hangover did not end the tradition. It began it. In warm valleys where bees nested in fallen trees, people began stealing honey. Honey mixed with rainwater and wild yeast makes something ancient and golden. Mead. It happened by chance. A cracked hive, a puddle, the sun. Days later, a sweet fizzy drink waited for whoever was bold enough to taste it. Archaeologists have found residues of honey wine in jars over 9,000 years old, long before writing, before bronze, before history had a voice. Mead was the first intentional drink, a bridge between nature's accident and human desire. It taught our ancestors that fermentation could be tamed. Soon they realized fermented fruits lasted longer. A few gourds filled with leftover juice could stay drinkable for weeks, safer than water that might sicken them. The drink didn't just taste good, it preserved life. Every sip was both celebration and survival. They began guarding these finds like fire, covering vessels with leaves, storing them in shade. The earliest brewers were not farmers or monks. They were wanderers who refused to waste a miracle. Somewhere between 10,000 and 8,000 BCE, when agriculture began, the idea of drink changed forever. A settled people could experiment. In the valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates, the future Mesopotamia, someone noticed that wet grain left too long began to bubble, to sour, to shimmer with life. Barley became liquid bread. The first beer was born, thick, cloudy, more porridge than pint. It was eaten with straws to avoid the floating bits, and it was beloved. Beer became food, faith, and payment. Workers on the first cities drank it as part of their wage. Gods were offered it in temples. The world had gone from accidental buzz to organized brewing, but the spirit behind it remained the same, a longing to taste joy. Alcohol did something even more powerful than feeding or warming. It changed how people saw each other. Around a shared cup, laughter came easier, boundaries softened, songs were born, fear dissolved, ideas mixed. The drink became a mirror of humanity itself. Our need to connect, to escape, to belong. Every sip was a small rebellion against loneliness. When early humans got wasted, they weren't just chasing pleasure. They were discovering communion. Of course, morning always arrived. Mouths dry, stomachs uneasy, heads pounding like distant thunder. Confusion, laughter, regret, all the same feelings we know today. But with the ache came a story. Remember the night of the sweet fruit? Remember how the stars danced? Memory stitched pain into meaning. The hangover became history, and because of that they did it again. The next 1,000 years would see humans carry that secret everywhere. Fermentation moved with migration, crossing mountains and deserts. Wherever there was sugar, yeast, and time, the alchemy returned. Drink followed us like shadow. It would shape gods, politics, art, and medicine. It would cause wars and weddings, crimes and cures. But at its beginning, it was only this: a moment of sweetness on the tongue, a laugh in the dark, a spark of warmth that made the cold world feel friendly. Hey guys, as you drift to sleep tonight, imagine that first taste, the fruit, the laughter, the golden light of discovery. It was the start of a habit, a culture, a civilization built on curiosity and courage. Next time, we'll pour a little deeper, into the ancient breweries of Mesopotamia and Egypt, where beer wasn't just a drink, it was religion. Tonight we travel forward a few thousand years, past the forests and the wild fruit, into a world that is learning to stand still. The wandering hunters have begun to settle. Seeds are being saved. Clay is being shaped. Villages rise near rivers that glitter under the sun. This is the birthplace of something new, civilization, and with it the first people who looked at a bubbling jar and thought, what if we made this on purpose? Between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers lies a wide green cradle, Mesopotamia. The soil here is kind, the water steady, the sun relentless. From this valley came writing, cities, and perhaps the greatest discovery of all, beer. Farmers learned that barley left wet too long began to swell, crack, and smell faintly sweet. Left a few more days, it fizzed like fruit in summer. The taste was strange, thick, grainy, but comforting. It filled the stomach and softened the edge of long work. They called it sikaru, liquid bread. To the Sumerians, beer wasn't an indulgence. It was nutrition. It kept the labourers of temples strong and kept waterborne illness at bay. Each citizen, even the smallest child, had a daily ration. And yet, when the sun set and the jars were lifted, it became more than food. It became fellowship. In the city of Uruk, where writing was first scratched into clay, priestesses of the goddess Ninkasi tended rows of large clay vats. They mixed crushed barley, water, and a special bread called bapir, baked, dried, then crumbled into the brew. When the air grew warm, the mixture began to hum with bubbles. The priestesses sang while they worked, part recipe, part prayer. Ninkasi, You are the one who waters the malt set on the ground. You are the one who bakes the bapir in the great oven. You are the one who holds with both hands the sweet wort. It was the first written hymn to beer, 4,000 years before the first Bible verse. The yeast was invisible, mysterious, proof that the gods moved through ordinary things. Every jar that foamed was a small miracle, every sip a communion. Clay tablets tell us that workers who built ziggurats, those giant stairways to heaven, were paid in beer. A strong man earned about 2 litres a day, skilled artisans more. It wasn't luxury, it was salary. Imagine the world's first payday. Jars passed from hand to hand, laughter spreading through hot air thick with dust. The foam on the surface was as satisfying as coins are today. To drink was to belong. Even kings held feasts where servants refilled mugs carved from alabaster. The act of lifting a cup united farmer and priest, labourer and ruler. It was equality, poured and shared. South along the Nile, another civilization was discovering the same secret. Egyptian brewers used dates, barley, and sometimes honey, fermenting them in large clay jars sealed with woven reeds. The result was golden, foamy, thick as cream. Tomb paintings show men straining mash through baskets, women stirring vats as cats watched from corners. Beer was offered to gods and placed beside the dead for their journey. Even in eternity, no one wanted to go thirsty. Hieroglyphs for beer appear beside those for joy and life. And when the workers built the pyramids, they were rationed a type of brew so nourishing that it kept them alive in the desert heat. It wasn't about escape, it was about endurance. Brewing became science before science had a name. The brewers learned to watch the temperature of air by touch, the thickness of mash by sound, the life of yeast by smell. When bubbles sang quickly, they knew to cool it. When the foam turned dull, they whispered that the goddess had finished her work. Every jar told a story. This one fermented in moonlight. That one caught rain from the east. Beer became poetry. In time, people realized that flavor changed with region. The river beer of Egypt was sweet and thick. The mountain beer of Anatolia was sharp and dry. Taste became geography, and geography became identity. As villages turned into cities, alcohol turned into ritual. Every harvest brought festivals, songs, masks, and overflowing jars. The intoxication wasn't just pleasure, it was a bridge between earth and heaven. People believed the gods drank with them, danced with them, spoke through their laughter. When the world blurred, it felt divine. Some tablets even warn, "Drink not until the river swells in your head." They already knew the danger, but they also knew the joy. Balance was the first lesson of civilization. Archaeologists have found rooms lined with clay jars and benches, public spaces where strangers gathered to drink. They were the first taverns, a place where news travelled faster than the wind, where alliances formed, songs grew louder, and truth sometimes slipped out between sips. The ancient bartender was a storyteller, judge and confessor, and above every doorway hung the same invisible promise: here, for a moment, the world is kind. In nearly every early culture, women were the brewers. They made the dough, baked the bapir, stirred the vats. In Sumer and Egypt they held brewing licenses, symbols of divine favour. The warmth of fire, the patience of stirring, the intuition of fermentation. all seen as sacred feminine crafts. Centuries later, when brewing moved to monasteries, that legacy would fade. But here, at the dawn of alcohol, women were chemists, priests, and providers. To the ancients, beer wasn't escape, it was connection. Connection to land, to grain, to gods, to each other. Every culture that learned to grow crops eventually learned to brew them. It was inevitable. Humans cannot look at something bubbling with promise and walk away. Beer taught them that transformation was possible. Grain to drink, labour to joy, chaos to comfort. The lesson would spread, carried by caravans and sailors. Wherever humans went, fermentation followed. Invisible, patient, divine. As the centuries passed, the beer drinkers of Mesopotamia and Egypt began to meet something new. Grapes. Sweet, fragile, wild fruit that carried its own kind of magic. And somewhere in the hills of the Mediterranean, someone crushed those grapes, left them in the sun, and watched the juice turn red and fragrant and alive. The world was about to taste its first wine. Somewhere in the Bronze Age, a traveller left a basket of grapes in the heat. Days later, he returned to find the fruit broken and bubbling, its skin soft, its juice alive. Curious, he tasted it, and the world shifted. The juice was no longer fruit, it was fire wrapped in sweetness. The first wine had been born. From that moment, grapes became sacred. They carried both joy and mystery, a reminder that decay could bloom into delight. The ancients didn't see this as science. They saw it as divine alchemy. The gods had shown them that even what dies can rise again as something beautiful. The earliest vineyards appeared in the lands we now call Georgia, Armenia, and Persia, slope-drenched in sun, earth-stained red by iron and clay. Archaeologists have found jars here lined with traces of tartaric acid, the fingerprint of wine, over 8,000 years old. Vines were planted, pruned, worshipped. Every harvest was a prayer answered, and soon the craft spread like the roots of the vines themselves, from the Caucasus to Egypt, from Egypt to Greece, from Greece to the heart of the ancient world. In Egypt, beer still fed the workers, but wine was for the afterlife. In royal tombs, amphorae filled with red and white vintages were buried beside the dead, labelled by year, vineyard, and taste. One jar reads, Year 17 of the reign of King Tutankhamun, sweet wine of the house of Eton, chief vintner Kemwaset. These were not peasants' brews. They were gifts for eternity. In temples, priests poured wine for Osiris, god of rebirth. The dark liquid symbolizing blood, sacrifice, renewal. To drink it was to share in divine life. Even the hieroglyph for to celebrate shows two arms raised around a jar. Celebration and wine became one. The Greeks didn't invent wine, but they gave it a soul. In their mythology, wine was the blood of Dionysus, the god of ecstasy, chaos, and transformation. His festivals were loud, wild, tender things, music and dancing, masks and laughter, people becoming someone or something else for a night. To the Greeks, intoxication wasn't sin, it was balance, a way to let go of logic for a little while and meet the divine hidden in emotion. Plato himself wrote that wine fills the soul with courage, but only when taken with care. Too much, and reason drowned. Too little, and joy faded. Between those edges lay wisdom. If beer built temples, wine built conversation. The Greek symposium, literally drinking together, was half feast, half philosophy session. cushions scattered on marble floors, silver cups glinting in torchlight, musicians playing slow notes. Wine was diluted with water. 3 parts water, 1 part wine, not to weaken it, but to lengthen the pleasure. As the night deepened, talk grew slower, ideas bolder, laughter softer. They discussed love, truth, death, beauty, all under the same hum of intoxication. When the Romans came, they carried vineyards with them. They planted vines everywhere the legions marched, from Spain to Gaul, from Britain to the Black Sea. Wine became empire. It flowed in banquets, temples, barracks. They flavoured it with honey, pepper, herbs, even seawater. A Roman feast was a performance. Couches and garlands, silver trays, servants pouring endlessly. And yet, beneath the luxury, the same humble yeast was doing its quiet work. The same miracle repeated in every cup. Sugar to spirit, fruit to forgetfulness. Every ancient culture saw something holy in losing control. To drink was to surrender, to trust the unseen, to dissolve the boundaries between flesh and faith. The Greeks had Dionysus, the Egyptians had Osiris, the Persians toasted Ahura Mazda, and the Hebrews later spoke of wine as the joy of the heart. In temples and fields alike, intoxication was never just about the drink. It was about being touched by something larger. A sip became a prayer, a toast became a ritual, and a hangover, just the body coming back from heaven. Of course, not every cup was holy. Ancient texts warn of the dangers of too much wine, of blurred judgment, broken families, forgotten duties. The same drink that united people could divide them. But even this duality fascinated early humanity, how the same liquid could heal or harm depending on intention. So they wrote laws, prayers, and myths around it, trying to make peace with a god that lived inside a jug. When the Romans fell, the vines remained. In the quiet monasteries of medieval Europe, monks kept tending them, pruning, harvesting, perfecting the art that had once been divine madness. The god had become a discipline, and through those silent hands, the ancient spirit of Dionysus kept living, softer now, but still shimmering in every glass. The air warm with bees, the smell of grapes and dust, people laughing, praying, singing, raising cups, not just to forget, but to feel alive. That's what wine meant at the beginning. Not escape, but connection. A way to taste life a little deeper. Next time, we'll move into the Middle Ages, when magic and mead filled cold stone halls, and monks turned brewing into art. Tonight, our story moves into the long, candlelit corridors of the Middle Ages, a time of faith and fear, of alchemy and superstition, when the art of brewing passed from temples and vineyards into the cold hands of monks, mothers, and wanderers. The ancient gods had faded, but their gift, the warm fire in a cup, still lived on. Tonight, we pour that history slowly. After Rome's fall, the world grew quieter. Cities crumbled, trade slowed, and what survived did so in pockets. Farmsteads, monasteries, small villages scattered across wild, dark forests. But in those quiet places, people still brewed. It was no longer about luxury or ceremony. It was survival. Water could sicken you, beer could not. A bubbling pot of ale was as common in a home as a loaf of bread. Children drank it, travellers paid for it, and every village had its alewife, a woman who stirred magic into her kettle each week. These women didn't write recipes. They trusted the look of the foam, the smell of the mash, the sound of bubbles whispering that life had begun. Their secret wasn't yeast. They didn't even know the word. Their secret was patience. Long before hops and barley ruled, there was mead, honey wine, smooth, golden, and as ancient as the moon. In the cold lands of Scandinavia and the forest of England, bees became alchemists. Mead was seen as sunlight captured in liquid form. Vikings drank it before voyages, poets before songs, lovers before weddings. To them it wasn't alcohol, it was courage. A jar of honey, water, and air could transform itself into joy. People believed it came from the gods, and maybe in a way it did. Even today, archaeologists find mead residue in burial sites, offerings for journeys beyond life. Because if there is another world, they thought, surely it too needs a toast. When Europe turned to Christianity, drinking didn't disappear. It found a new home, the monastery. Behind stone walls and stained glass, monks studied scripture by day and perfected brewing by night. They experimented, refined, recorded. For them, ale was both discipline and devotion. Brewing kept monasteries alive. It funded hospitals, schools, and charity. It was considered a gift of labour to God. Monks were the scientists of their age, measuring time by dripping water clocks, judging fermentation by smell and touch. They built cool stone cellars for barrels, learned to boil water before brewing, and unknowingly saved countless lives. Beer was their safe drink, their bread, their medicine. The Latin texts even called it cerevisia sancta, holy beer. For centuries, ale tasted wild, flavoured with herbs like mugwort, yarrow, and heather. Every village had its blend, every region its taste. Then came a plant from the German forests, small, bitter, magical, hops. At first, people resisted. They said it ruined the sweetness. But the monks noticed something. Beer brewed with hops lasted longer. It stayed fresh for months instead of days. By the 11th century, hops had changed everything. Brewing was no longer just local or fleeting. It was trade. Beer could travel. Civilization once again had found a reason to raise a glass. Outside the monasteries, life was rough. Roads were muddy, work endless, winters cruel. But at day's end there was always one warm door, the tavern. Candles flickered, benches creaked, songs rose from tired voices. A mug of ale wasn't luxury, it was hope in liquid form. There were no menus, no measures, no pretense. The tavern keeper poured until the clay mug overflowed, and laughter filled the gaps where language failed. A traveller might trade a story for a drink or a song for supper. News travelled on, breath warmed by beer, and in those smoky rooms the idea of community was quietly brewing too. Of course, wherever there is transformation, there is suspicion. Alewives who brewed too well, whose pots bubbled without fail, were sometimes whispered about. People said they were witches, that they stirred spells instead of grain. It was superstition, but also fear. Fear of knowledge, fear of women, fear of power. The broomstick they used to hang hops to dry. It became a symbol of witchcraft. The tall, pointed hats they wore to stand out at markets. Another myth, reborn as menace. Many of those accused of witchery were simply brewers, keepers of the oldest science in the world. They turned water into joy, and for that they were feared. Around the same time, scholars called alchemists began searching for the secret of transformation. They wanted gold, immortality, perfection. But what they really discovered was distillation. By heating fermented liquid, they could capture its spirit. clear, sharp, powerful. The age of wine and beer was giving birth to something new, spirits. They didn't know it yet, but this would change everything. From monasteries to markets, from peasants to princes, people were about to learn what it meant to drink fire itself. Yet through all of this, the superstition, the invention, the danger, one thing never changed. People still gathered around the fire with a cup in hand, telling stories, singing softly, holding close the warmth that made life bearable. The drink was not escape, it was reminder that even in the darkest winters, something could still bloom, bubble and glow. As you fall asleep tonight, imagine those cold halls of stone, lit by firelight and candle wax, the air sweet with barley and honey. Somewhere, a monk stirs a kettle and hums a hymn. Somewhere else, an alewife smiles at the foam on her brew. They don't know each other, but both are doing the same small miracle, turning patience into warmth. And so, the story of getting wasted became the story of endurance, of turning cold into comfort. Next time, we'll follow the alchemist's fire and see how spirits, whiskey, rum, brandy, set the world ablaze. It began quietly, like most revolutions. In small stone rooms lit by candlelight, alchemists heated wine and watched it disappear into vapour, rise, twist, and cool again into something clear. What dripped from their copper coils was stronger, purer, sharper than anything the world had tasted. They called it aqua vitae, the water of life. At first they didn't drink it. It was medicine, an elixir, believed to cure fever, fear, and sadness. Monks kept flasks of it in apothecaries, using it to clean wounds or ease pain. But soon, curiosity, and perhaps loneliness, led someone to taste it. And humanity's oldest experiment began again. In the cold stone monasteries of Ireland and Scotland, monks began distilling barley beer to preserve it. The result was amber, fragrant, and alive with warmth. They called it Wishy Beatha, water of life. Over time, the name softened on the tongue. Whiskey. It wasn't just drink, it was devotion. Each batch carried the scent of grain and smoke, each sip a spark against the endless chill. The monks believed it held the breath of the divine, and in a way, it did. When the monasteries faded, their students, farmers, blacksmiths, wanderers, carried the craft into the hills. From their stills, the world's first whiskies flowed like gold through mist. Distillation wasn't new. Ancient Persians had used it to make perfumes, the Chinese to purify medicine. But when Europe learned it, they turned it into poetry. It was alchemy made practical. Take something humble and transform it into something transcendent. In that sense, it was the same dream humans had always chased, to turn base matter into meaning. In every drop there was a story of transformation, grain to spirit, patience to flame. The still became a symbol of control, of taming chaos with curiosity. And though most didn't know the chemistry, they knew the feeling that somewhere inside this glowing drink lived a little piece of the sun. As ships began crossing oceans, another kind of spirit was born. On Caribbean plantations, enslaved labourers cut sugar cane for European masters. The leftover molasses, once waste, began to ferment in the heat. Distilled, it became dark, sweet and strong. Rum. Rum powered the age of empire. It fueled sailors, bribed officials, paid for spices, slaves and soldiers. The triangle traders, Europe, Africa, the Americas, ran on sugar, human suffering, and liquor. It was the drink of pirates, the comfort of the enslaved, and the currency of colonization. Back in Europe, the French had discovered another magic. They distilled wine itself, creating something smoother, warmer, quieter, brandy. In candlelit inns and noble halls alike, it became the drink of reflection. The taste lingered like memory. It was said that a glass of brandy could make an old man feel young, and a young man feel wise. Brandy travelled easily, in barrels, on horseback, across continents. Every region gave it a name: cognac, armagnac, eau de vie. Distillation had turned into art. A single fruit could now become a lifetime of flavour. What began as a monk's experiment had become the world's first luxury. Spirits were more than drink. They were the embodiment of transformation, the very essence of fire captured and tamed. To distill was to refine, to purify, to find truth through heat. The still, glowing in dark workshops, became a mirror of the human spirit itself. We too are shaped by pressure, purified by fire, transformed by time. Perhaps that's why we've always felt a strange kinship with what we drink. Every sip is a small echo of that eternal process. The messy becoming beautiful, the rough becoming clear. Even as distillation spread, the church debated it. Was it divine or dangerous? Was firewater a gift from heaven or a temptation from below? The answer, as always, depended on who was drinking. For some, it was medicine. For others, sin. But no matter the sermon, the stills kept glowing in barns and backrooms, their vapours rising like prayers. By the 17th century, every culture had its own potion. The Russians had vodka, the Dutch had gin, the French had brandy, the Scots had whiskey, the Caribbean had rum. Each reflected its people, their soil, their struggle, their soul. Vodka was cold and clear as the tundra. Gin was herbal, sharp, and disciplined. Rum was wild and sunburnt. Whiskey was earthy and patient. The world had found a new way to tell its story, not through words, but through flavour. As you drift asleep tonight, picture those copper stills glowing in the dark, smoke curling toward the rafters, the soft drip of firewater into a wooden cask. It was the sound of humanity mastering transformation, turning nature's chaos into comfort. But every flame casts a shadow, and soon that shadow would stretch across the oceans. The same spirits that fueled empires would also fuel rebellion, taverns turning into meeting halls, barrels becoming symbols of freedom. And so, our story moves from alchemy to revolution. The 17th and 18th centuries were the age of sails, oceans stitched with trade routes, ships heavy with sugar, molasses, and misery. In the Caribbean, where the air smelled of cane and salt, enslaved people laboured endlessly under the sun, cutting the stalks that made Europe rich. The leftovers, as a sticky black syrup called molasses, were thrown into barrels and left to ferment. Then, one day, someone ran it through a still. What dripped out was dark, sweet, and strong. Rum. It became the drink of the New World. Sailors traded it, pirates plundered it, colonists toasted with it. A triangle of suffering and wealth formed. Sugar from the islands, rum to Europe, weapons and goods to Africa, and enslaved people back to the plantations. The barrels rolled endlessly, carrying not just liquor but lives. Rum was the fuel of empire and the taste of rebellion waiting to ignite. On the high seas, rum became legend. It was rationed to sailors in the navy. 1 cup a day to keep courage alive. Mixed with water, lime, and sugar, it became grog, the sailor's lifeline against the rot of the ocean. But among pirates, rum was more than rations. It was freedom in a bottle. They drank to defy the world that chained them. Each toast was a small revolution, a promise that even in lawlessness there could be laughter. Stories say Captain Jack Rackham's crew drank until the stars blurred. Some say Blackbeard mixed gunpowder into his rum for effect. The truth hardly mattered. What mattered was the idea that somewhere beyond the horizon a man could drink and live by his own rules. On land, the tavern became the heart of rebellion. In America's 13 colonies, rum flowed freely. It was cheaper than tea, safer than water, and always within reach. These weren't elegant places. Wooden beams, smoke-thick air, tables stained with years of laughter and argument. But inside, ideas began to ferment. In Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, men gathered to talk about taxes, kings, and rights. They didn't know it yet, but they were brewing revolution as surely as beer. Each speech began with a drink. Each rebellion began with a toast. Freedom, like fermentation, started small, in the warmth of shared courage. As colonists pushed west, rum became harder to get. Sugar was far away, but grain was everywhere. So they turned to what they knew: barley, rye, corn. The stills of the old world came west, and whiskey became the spirit of the frontier. Every valley had a still, every family a recipe. Whiskey was money, medicine, and friendship. In a land without banks, a barrel of whiskey was safer than gold. When the new American government tried to tax it, farmers revolted. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794 wasn't just about money. It was about pride. The belief that something made by the hands of ordinary people should never be owned by kings or governments. They lost, but the message burned clear. The spirit of independence was as fiery as the drink itself. Across the ocean, another revolution was brewing. Not in fields or ships, but in the narrow streets of London. Distillation had reached the masses, and gin, once a herbal medicine, became the people's escape. It was cheap, potent, and everywhere. The gin craze of the 1700s turned London into a haze of intoxication. Poor families drank to forget. Artists and aristocrats drank to feel alive. The city pulsed with a new kind of chaos. Too fast, too loud, too human. The government cracked down, plastering posters that warned, "Drunk for a penny, dead drunk for twopence." But gin refused to disappear. It was the voice of the forgotten, sweet and sharp and unapologetic. The world was realizing something. Every age has its drink, and every drink tells the truth about its people. Alcohol had always been two things: comfort and chaos. In the age of rebellion, it became both weapon and wound. It united rebels and enslaved workers, fueled empires and destroyed them, built nations and blurred their morals. The same rum that toasted freedom in Boston had been born from the pain of those denied it. The same whiskey that symbolized independence led to wars and bans a century later. Humanity was learning that intoxication doesn't end when the cup is empty. It lingers, in memory, in consequence, in the stories we tell ourselves to make it all make sense. As the 18th century ended, the world itself felt tipsy. Empires cracked, revolutions burned, and freedom became a contagious idea. In France, the same streets that smelled of wine and bread soon smelled of gunpowder and smoke. In America, taverns turned into town halls. In the Caribbean, rebellion brewed among those who had cut the sugarcane for too long. The world had been drinking the same spirit, and now it was drunk on change. And when the hangover came, it wasn't from rum or whiskey. It was from history itself, from realizing how much the fire that warms us can also burn. Hey guys, as you drift to sleep tonight, imagine the sound of a creaking ship and a mug set gently on a wooden table. Imagine the laughter of sailors, the whispers of revolutionaries, the hum of a city that can't stop dreaming. Every age finds its courage somewhere, sometimes in words, sometimes in faith, and sometimes in a cup raised beneath candlelight. What began as an accident of fermentation had now become a mirror of civilization itself. Next time, we'll see what happens when the fire cools, when nations grow weary of excess, and the world begins to search for meaning in moderation. Tonight the cups are empty, the music has faded, the taverns are quiet, and history itself is waking up with a dry throat. Every age of indulgence ends the same way, with a pause, a breath, and a little regret. The story of getting wasted is also the story of realizing why we drink in the first place. So tonight, we're walking through the centuries after the fire, through wars and reforms, through temperance and prohibition, when the world tried to sober up, and in doing so discovered what intoxication really meant. The 19th century dawned like a slow sunrise after a long fevered night. Europe was rebuilding, America was expanding, and the industrial world was taking its first mechanical breath. The still smoked, the tavern still sang, but the hangover had arrived. Factories replaced fields, cities swelled. Workers crowded into narrow alleys, earning little and drinking much. Gin shops multiplied like mushrooms after rain. Whiskey flowed in the frontier towns of America, a comfort against the loneliness of distance. For the first time, governments began to see alcohol not as blessing or trade, but as a problem. The temperance movement began softly. A few sermons, a few pamphlets, urging moderation rather than abstinence. But soon the whisper turned into a crusade. In small towns and grand churches, reformers argued that drink was the devil's disguise, a thief of wages, a destroyer of homes. Women who had watched husbands stumble home from taverns began leading marches through muddy streets. Their banners read, "Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours." For many, temperance wasn't about hatred. It was about hope. A dream that maybe, if the bottle was set down, families could heal, hunger could ease, and peace could return. And for a while it worked. Taverns closed, laws tightened, but the human heart, restless, yearning, curious, never stays silent for long. In the early 20th century, America made a decision that seemed impossible. In 1920, the 18th Amendment banned the production, sale, and transport of alcohol. For the first time in modern history, the oldest habit in the world was declared illegal. The streets went quiet. Breweries shut down, barrels dumped into rivers. For a moment it felt like a new dawn, clean, sober, righteous. But behind the silence a new kind of music began to play. Jazz. In smoky basements and hidden cellars, speakeasies were born. Passwords whispered through alleyways, cups clinking behind locked doors. The drink had gone underground, and in doing so had never felt more alive. Gangsters built empires from smuggled whiskey. Politicians drank in secret. Ordinary people discovered the thrill of rebellion all over again. Prohibition had meant to cure society. Instead, it reminded humanity of something essential. Forbidden fruit ferments fastest. By 1933, the law was undone. The United States raised its glass again, not to drunkenness, but to the return of choice. The hangover had taught a lesson. You can't outlaw longing. Meanwhile, in Europe, the story unfolded differently. Wine remained part of the table. Sacred, simple, cultural. The French drank for taste, the Italians for family, the Germans for tradition. In Asia, rice wine, sake, and spirits like soju and baijiu continued rituals centuries old. In the Middle East, where Islam forbade alcohol, other comforts filled the evenings: tea, music, poetry, and memory. Humanity's thirst had many shapes, and not all of them came in bottles. The 19 thirsters were tired. The world had danced through the roar of the 20s and woken to a hangover called depression. Bars reopened, but the mood was different now, quieter, gentler. People didn't drink to defy the law anymore. They drank to forget the news. A glass of whiskey after a long day. A bottle of cheap wine shared by friends under a single lamp. Alcohol was still escape, but now it was also company. Jazz clubs blossomed like late-night flowers. Singers in shimmering dresses crooned about love and loneliness. Saxophones wept for the world that was changing too fast. The bar was no longer a battlefield. It was a theatre. The bartender became a quiet confessor. Every drink a tiny story, bitters and sugar, smoke and sweet. Out of recovery came ritual, and ritual became culture. Then came war. Twice. The world was torn open again, and liquor flowed through trenches and camps like liquid memory. Soldiers carried flasks for courage, nurses for sanity, officers for grief. When the bombs fell and the sirens screamed, bars became shelters of light and music. After the wars, people didn't want to drink to forget anymore. They wanted to drink to live. Champagne for peace, beer for friendship, wine for love. The toast became a prayer for tomorrow. The 1950s and 60s turned drinking into art again. Cocktails became paintings in glass, martinis like liquid moonlight, rum punches like tropical sunsets. Air travel spread flavours across continents. A Parisian could taste Caribbean rum. A New Yorker could sip Japanese whiskey. The world was mixing itself, shaken and stirred. Advertising turned alcohol into identity. The elegant man with a cigarette and scotch. The woman with a glass of bubbly, and a smile just out of reach. It was no longer about necessity or faith. It was about belonging. But beneath the glamour, the old questions lingered. Why do we need this? What are we really chasing when we raise a glass? By the 1970s and 80s, the pendulum swung again. Science began to speak. Doctors warned of the costs of excess. Societies studied addiction like an epidemic. The conversation shifted from moral to medical. For the first time, we saw drinking not as sin or virtue, but as struggle. And out of that understanding came compassion. People formed groups, spoke their stories, shared their failures and redemptions. They found that sobriety wasn't just the absence of drink. It was the presence of peace. Humanity was learning to forgive itself. As the 21st century dawned, the world had changed again. The old barrels and bottles still stood ready. but now they shared space with mocktails, mindfulness, and moderation. People no longer drank just to feel different. They drank to remember, to connect, to slow down. The hangover of history had finally taught its lesson. Balance is not punishment. It's grace. The same fire that once burned temples and fueled empires can now warm a quiet evening between friends. Humanity didn't quit drinking. It just learned to sip its story slowly. So here we are, after 10,000 years of chasing warmth in a cup. From fruit left too long in the sun, to temples, taverns, and neon bars, every age raised its glass for a different reason. To survive, to forget, to celebrate, to feel a little less alone. The drink was never the story itself. The story was us, the restless species that turned fermentation into faith, fire into comfort, and hangovers into history. We've learned that pleasure can teach, that excess can scar, and that balance is the oldest wisdom of all. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine that first human by the fire, holding a sweet, bubbling fruit, laughing softly, not knowing they've just started a ritual that would span the world. The fire still burns, sometimes in a bottle, sometimes in a story, sometimes just in the quiet warmth between friends. To curiosity, to kindness, to the long, beautiful hangover called humanity.